Hi, Dr. Krista. Welcome to the show. I'm thrilled to have you join us. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me, Vanessa. I'm so happy to be here.
Oh my goodness, so am I. As we were talking about earlier and then in our meeting a couple weeks ago, I was sharing with you that there are some interviews that I have with guests that are just wow, they resonate on levels that I just can barely even articulate myself, and this is going to be one of them. It's just there's so much that we're going to be discussing that is just highly relatable when it comes to my own journey. And I cannot wait because I think that you have so much to say, I think, about what we're going to be discussing, which largely involves, people that have these long chronic illness type journeys or these symptoms that sort of go on for months to years and everything that's involved in that. And so, and sort of what happens to us as we walk these roads. So again, I am incredibly excited to get into this. This is going to be fantastic. So again, welcome.
Oh, thank you. Yes,
Yeah,
it's gonna be great.
welcome. Yeah. So here's where I sort of want to start. I was thinking about this, and when I was prepping for this show, I was thinking, we've talked so much here. I mean, it's obviously endless. We can talk about illness and infections, and what causes illness and what causes people to sort of walk these paths. But at a certain point, I feel like there's more that starts to take place,
Right.
and it's not just about the illness, right? It's about our bodies, our minds, our brains
Mhm.
adapting to the illness.
Yes.
And I think that I've seen that so much with myself. And, I'm not sure with the phrasing to appropriately use, but I would like to say maybe, and you can definitely elaborate on this, but, health trauma, right? Like what happens to us when we sort of go down these paths and we go down these hard, trials and journeys. And so I would love for you to sort of tell us what you see in your practice and kind of just give us a little snapshot of the people that you work with.
Absolutely. So when it comes to, health trauma and I can even speak to this as my own patient experience and now this is where I like to focus on with my patients is there's a point in, if you've had a symptom persisting anything persisting really longer than 3 months, your brain creates a neural pathway, right? Becomes a physiological habit, right? This is part of our limbic system. And so, at some point, especially if you're in this kind of merry-go-round of doctor hopping and diagnoses piling up and flare-up episodes, the brain actually starts to develop what can look like a PTSD brain setup, right? And it's complex PTSD, which is more like death by a thousand paper cuts is how we like to describe it. And so we as patients, right, when we're chronically ill, we deal with so much on a daily that maybe, someone not with a chronic infectious load deals with on the daily. We learn to adapt. I have so many patients that are like, "Oh my gosh, I was filling out this questionnaire for my appointment today and I didn't even realize that I walk around with heart palpitations or that my low level congestion or coughing in the morning isn't normal. I've just gotten so used to it." And so, when we look at what's happening in recovery, we do have to think about what are we going to do beyond the biochemistry, the supplements, the services and all of these things in order to help the brain feel safe again from these compounding traumas. And so without, identifying with a label of complex PTSD, that's just a great setup to understand the mechanism that is happening in the brain and the body, and even the cycle that goes on with, trauma, remembrance, symptom activation. So there's this big loop, and so I see that with a lot of patients that come to me, which is where I focus a lot on brain retraining and brain rewiring. I do it in a little bit of a different way than most probably are familiar with, like a DNRS or a primal trust are the two. And I love those programs. I really do. I refer a lot of patients to do that as homework. But we really get into the nitty gritty, even taking a symptom, a solo symptom, and rewiring all of the neural connections to that symptom, we can actually understand that the body is always like working for you, right? Especially in this big autoimmune body betrayal, body's attacking itself. We're not looking at symptoms as messengers, we're looking at them as the enemy. And when we can start rewiring how we respond to those symptoms, it can be an absolute game changer for understanding why they even showed up in the first place from a somato-emotional standpoint.
Yeah. Oh my goodness. 2 things that you said I'd love to touch on, and this was kind of a really cool, like, aha for me as
Mm,
well, is I love how you said without focusing on another label such as complex PTSD, because I think what can happen is that people are whether they're conscious or I mean, whether it's conscious or
mhm,
subconscious, what can happen is then they find out that they have an issue with post-traumatic stress from
right.
the path that they've been walking down, and then they're like, "Oh, and now I have this." As well. So they literally compound that on top of the problem instead in kind of almost and again, no shame, right? I say this all the time,
Right.
like no
Yeah.
shame about it, but then they sort of like identify with that. Well, now I have this issue.
Uh-huh.
And
Yep.
so it's like, and I really liked how you said that it's whether or not there's a label there or not, like it's fine, right? We don't have to necessarily assign it. We can just tackle it, right?
Mhm.
And then appropriately walk down sort of a new path, right? Like where we're starting to untangle things. I love that. And then the second thing that you said, and I feel like this was just also addressed in a recent show that I recorded. I'm not sure if it's one that's released yet, but I was also talking about how in my own personal journey, how much of a game changer it has been over the years to
Mhm.
unravel that thought of the body attacking itself.
Yeah.
Because when you get in these circles and even these support system circles, right, with others that are going through like support groups can be great, but they could also be a trap, right? Because
Yes.
and social media does the same thing where it's like, you kind of perpetuate this idea that in this case, the body's attacking itself and blah 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 when words are so powerful and
Yes.
the body is so miraculous and it's really doing everything that it is designed to do to keep you alive and afloat. And if that includes adapting, which it is always adapting to the environment that you give it, then
Yeah.
what a beautiful thing, even if those things that are happening, those symptoms that are happening, don't feel very good, right?
100%. Yes.
Yeah, yeah. So when you are dealing, and again, these are just sort of some opening questions
Yeah.
here. When you are when you're seeing people say in your clinic and they're coming in
Mm.
with, a laundry list of things, or maybe they're not, right? Maybe they discover it along the way. What are the first things that you are paying attention to beyond labs? And actually, I'm just going to stop there because I feel like if I if I throw in a secondary question that I don't want this
No,
to
that
be a
was
lot.
great.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was great. No, that's a great place to start. And so I think even just to connect that to the piece that you mentioned before with, the label piece, and I think there's a big thing with confirmation bias, right? We're always looking for a confirmation for what our subconscious belief is, subconscious being the body, right? Conscious is your mind, subconscious is your body, which is where, we're all probably familiar with the book The Body Keeps the Score. It's been great, like bring great awareness, right, to so many people. And so I think to tie that and connect that in with, um, how I pay attention during that initial evaluation is how is the patient talking about their body? Are they looking for a confirmation that they have a bad body or a broken body? Or are they aligned with, I'm not understanding what's going on in my body right now. I'm looking for answers on that, but I do believe that I have an inherently good body and it was designed to heal. Right. And so if we're missing a little bit of the congruency there, I'll start there. 'Cause how often, and it's kind of force of habit, right? How often do we hear like my anxiety or my Lyme disease or my allergies? We claim it,
Yeah.
and like you said, words are so powerful. And it's not to say I think there's a very fine line between validation and awareness and then enabling that confirmation bias because a lot of us will run around and I say us because I've been there too with autoimmune conditions and be like, see, I knew it was never going to get better. I knew I would have a symptom flare up. And all you're doing there is the brain is looking for a guarantee and is looking for safety. So if you're in an unfamiliar, you're in gray area, you've never walked this road before, your brain wants to feel safe and familiarity of safety. And so even if we're consciously going, I want to get better, I want to get better, but the sick body is what's familiar. Your brain is going to go, see, I knew it was always going to be this way. This is how I'm used to. This is comfortable. And I don't want to get disappointed the next time I attempt a new supplement, a new doctor, etc., and it doesn't work. I'm just going to stay put right here.
Ooh. Absolutely. Oh my goodness, do I know this past well this past well. And it's
Yes.
like, in some ways, and forgive me, my friends, if you've heard me say this several times because I have said this several times, but it's that whole thing about bracing for impact too. That
Yeah.
even if you don't think that you're doing it, you are doing it, and it is a method of control because at least you're not disappointed with what's in front of you. And oh
Yeah.
my gosh, do I have so much grace and compassion for this because I've lived it. And to some degree, I'm still there. Like I was sharing with you, and I'll share with our audience. It's like I've come such a long way with my own journey and with chronic pain and the things that I have walked through and have been walking through, and I'm so grateful for that, but I see these symptoms return, and what I mean by symptoms is the mental and emotional
Yeah.
symptoms return when new things pop up, and I see that little hypervigilant guy pop up, right? And
Yeah.
go, "Oh, no, go right you gotta go check," right? "Oh, go to
That,
ChatGPT, see if it's gonna be okay for you." "Oh, you gotta figure out what it is," right? And it's like, you can almost disguise that as, "I'm just looking for information."
yeah.
I just want awareness. I'm someone I love to learn, but there's
Yeah.
a really fine line and a balance between that hypervigilant state and
Mhm.
the other, right? I'm sure you can elaborate on
Yes.
that.
Yeah, no, that's a great example of a very common pattern, right? So it's kind of this pattern if you're somebody that's been at this for a long time and you start out maybe with somebody new, you've got some hope, and then the minute maybe something goes a little bit sideways, you have a herx reaction, you have a flare up, or maybe you're triggered by an environmental toxin or a food, right? Something rocks the boat, even emotional stress maybe rocks the boat in your physiology. It's immediately like we're missing something, the worst thing possible might be wrong with me and I've got to go find a new solution. And so I think that's valuable as an insight. It's actually feedback for us to go, okay, I'm not feeling safe right now. What actually needs to change? Does my response to the symptom need to change? Does my approach actually need to change? And am I actually missing information? Right. And so, like, it's a good opportunity for us to take a step back and go, which one of these parts of my brain is running the show right now? Is it a fear flight response or is it actually like inner wisdom and knowledge that my body's telling me something? Right. Again, the question, what's the message behind the symptom, even if that symptom is a big emotional response?
Yeah. Oh my gosh. And you just hit the nail on the head. You said, is it wisdom or knowledge, or is it coming from fear? And oh, even from just like a faith standpoint, like
Yeah.
wisdom is not chaotic.
Right.
And a lot of times when we're in that hypervigilant, that fear-based mode, which again, no shame, like all the grace. I mean, I
Yeah.
know it more than anybody. That is not something that's calm and collected and peaceful. That is incredibly chaotic. And so I often describe it as, and I've seen myself in the past, I often describe it as almost like you see two people. I'm living the experience, right? So I'm having the experience and that fear is kicking in and all that. And then there's the logical, almost peaceful person that's next to me or almost above,
Yeah.
but watching me go through it. So I can actually feel and see both Vanessas, if that makes sense, because
Mhm.
I have the awareness and the knowledge of what's going on, but the body is doing something different. The brain is doing something different, and there's a little bit of a disconnect. And so I
100%.
think that that's probably what you're referring to. And I can imagine that so many people that come through your door are dealing with the same thing.
100%. Yes. And so even the analogy that you just gave of seeing two parts of yourself, my focus on brain retraining is primarily rooted in parts and memory therapy developed by Dr. Jay Norix. And the idea is that you have like multiple parts of the subconscious, right? And so we use this in daily language. Like a part of me wants to go out to dinner, but a part of me wants to stay home and rest. Right. And so these are different parts. And so what we actually want to do, I call it a committee meeting with your parts. Sit down and have a committee meeting. But it's in order to do that, just like in order to treat the proper issue, you have to identify it. We have to get aware of all of these different parts of us that are, coming up and learn how to renegotiate and talk to them because each one of them is playing a role in making you safe. And what happens is when you just mentioned, your body or your brain's doing one thing, but your body's on a different page, we call those parts that are stuck in a memory. So these are traumatized parts that's going, "Uh-oh, remember when this happened? This is reminding me of this really scary thing that happened, and I'm gonna do everything I can to make sure that that doesn't happen again." Right? And so it's running on outdated information. And a lot of times we're not aware of that because our brain is so like we want to forge forward, we want to heal, but the body's stuck in this outdated, stuck in the memory um, type of a mechanism. Like it's operating out of that stored memory. And so we often need to start by like bridging those two things together and allowing all those parts to have a chance to say what they need to say to us in essence.
Yeah, that's beautifully said. Would you say that most people that you see and that you help in your practice, they've already been through the gamut? They've already been to, 17 different professionals, or are they sort of at the beginning or mid stages of their journey? Like, what's the normal for you?
I would say my baseline is like, this is my last ditch resort type of a thing. Like I've tried everything. Case, which that was where I was too when I stumbled upon what I do now, and it changed my life. But I also get folks like we have a really sweet like family community here in Greenville, South Carolina, and so I also get moms that want to bring their kiddos in as an alternative to the pediatrician if they have a sniffle, right? So open to everybody who's lined up with the approach, but I would say definitely, get patients that come in with a folder full of blood work and other specialty testing, and they might have great information, but maybe the treatment approach wasn't, appropriate for their body, or the mental emotional limbic piece was left out and they're stuck spinning their wheels with really expensive supplements, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I find that to probably be not even just common, but almost anything I think that's complex and that's chronic. Um,
Yes.
Especially if you're walking the conventional path for the most
Mhm.
part, that is, I would say, I would, again, I'm not an expert, but I would venture to say that's almost 100% of the time that is left out.
I would agree. From what I've seen, there's never been a chronic complex case that does not have trapped emotions, does not have, emotional trauma, childhood trauma, maybe. And it might not be, like it might not be somebody who identifies themselves as having a quote traumatic childhood. The trauma may have even started, let's say 3 years ago when you started having to go to the doctor for your autoimmune condition, and you're dealing and you're still in survival mode so much that you are not even aware that you're dealing with some trauma, right? And that kind of goes back to like that white coat syndrome piece. And like you said, to kind of bring it into a spiritual, like hope deferred makes the heart sick. So the longer you go on without answers and or solutions, you might have good answers, but maybe not solutions, the more your heart posture is going to, partner up with maybe some hopelessness. And we don't want that, right? We need to have you up and feeling the energy of hope in order to shift that physiology.
Oh, that's so true. And that's so tough, because when your body doesn't feel well and you're walking, and I mean, again, this is like, I can speak to this just on levels that I almost feel like I don't have words for. But when you are walking out day to day and you are feeling those real symptoms, it's almost unnatural to not have these valleys of hopelessness, because who's perfect and who's not human, right? I mean,
Right.
it feels so unnatural to
Mhm.
just be like, "Oh yeah, I've got this," like we're good. When in reality, that's how is that even? I've never met a person yet, who has
Yeah.
not fell into those, like I said, those valleys. It just
Mhm.
doesn't feel like real life.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I think that's a great reminder, right? It's not about, kind of like an toxic positivity, if you will, right? Like saying one thing, believing another. And that's really where that congruency comes in. It's I think so many people when they're starting out, like a lot of folks for me that come in for that initial evaluation, they are reaching for like an olive branch of hope. Right. And so then we need to make sure, okay, your brain, your conscious mind is like, let's move towards healing. Let's try this, and the body might be lagging behind. And so bringing that mental congruency together, I think, is a game changer. I kind of call it like resetting your breakers, and making sure that all of your limbic pathways, right? Our body is it's conducted by our brain. So if the brain is stuck in adaptations or it's stuck in a hypervigilance state, like to come back again to this idea or the construct, the physiological construct of CPTSD, the amygdala, which is your emotional cortex, your threat response part of your limbic system, in trauma is hypervigilant, right? Sometimes it even changes size on a brain scan. We see that in PTSD, right? Sometimes it's a little bit larger because it's overworking. And so, a lot of patients that are dealing with chronic complex illness will have a brain that looks like post traumatic stress disorder. And so, addressing the physiology of that, along with regulating all of like the cascade of hormones, stress hormones, pro inflammatory cytokines, everything that falls out from that, I think that's a really important foundation to understand what's happening between the brain and the body, especially when a patient is, years into their journey and just not understanding where they're hitting roadblocks.
Yeah, yeah, oh, gosh. You said something just now that reminded me of a video that I was watching recently on the brain and how it can change based on trauma and how it looks different on scans. And the woman was talking about how people who had been through toxic or abusive relationships of various kinds had the same kind of scan as a veteran who went to active war.
Exactly.
And
Yep.
that I actually just got chills on the my arms because that is fascinating to me, and that just again proves the point that your body doesn't necessarily know the outer circumstances because those circumstances can look so different, but
Mhm.
it certainly knows the feeling. And
Oh, yeah.
that is just I mean, the representation of that. I mean, to see that on like a scan, despite the
Right.
outer circumstances is absolutely fascinating and also very unfortunate.
Oh my goodness, yes, and I can speak to that a little bit on, like, a personal note. So I had an EEG done a while back, and my brain looked like, like you said, a scan of maybe a veteran, and my husband is a veteran, he's a Marines veteran, and it was a really interesting conversation for us to open up as I started to get more aware of, like, "Whoa, I think I'm flashing back to something right now," and having the conversation with him and his perspective, his experience of um, working with a lot of folks with PTSD as a health coach, and I think that the idea of CPTSD or PTSD in situations like this, where yeah, we're safe. We have food, water, shelter, right? But we're dealing with something so chaotic inside. It's like a little bit of a sticky place to start talking about for a lot of folks, right? It feels maybe a little bit like, who am I to talk about PTSD when, all of these other people are experiencing all these huge traumatic things? But understanding, again, on a physiological level, not to adopt the label and not to, classify yourself as so traumatized, but to understand what does your brain look like and what's your brain doing when you're consciously like forging forward on symptom improvement, but your brain is constantly flashing back. How do we bridge those pieces together?
Oh, yeah. Wow. Wow. Absolutely just wonderful. That is such a great point, too, because I think a lot of people well, we kind of have like two sides of the spectrum. Lord, help me articulate this properly. But I feel like
Mhm.
we have two sides here. We have people who are like consistently, like almost like on the extreme, dramatic side of PTSD
Huh?
where it's like they're over diagnosing themselves and they probably don't have it's like everyone has health trauma today, or excuse me,
Sure.
has trauma, quote unquote,
Trauma.
and then
Yep.
is yeah, and air quotes.
Uh-huh.
But then there's the people, and I can honestly say I think I fit myself in this category humbly, where I almost don't want to speak about it as honestly as I can to especially some who have been through these massive things,
Sure.
right? Or like to compare, my story to say someone who's been through something that's so outwardly traumatic, like you said, like going to war, seeing things that are
Yeah.
really monumental, or going through devastating loss, or something like that.
Mhm.
That's hard, right? Because there's like emotions and feelings that come with that, and you don't want to dismiss or make people feel like their situations are a certain kind of a way. But what
Yep.
you're saying is that from a physiological response level, a lot of times what's going on in the body is fairly equal, which is again fascinating to me.
Right. And yeah, and I think understanding what is actually happening in the body, right? When we're flashing back, to come back to this connection between the amygdala and then your HPA axis, your hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, and to kind of help the listeners understand what's happening, how is this trauma response fueling the symptom cycle? The amygdala is, again, that threat response. It's responding to things that are happening around you and within you. And so, if you're having physiological imbalances, or you're having a stressful day, you just maybe had a tense conversation with somebody, that amygdala is constant, it's doing a scan all the time, right? It's kind of like the security guard of your body, right? It's taking a scan of what's happening. And so, if it identifies something that is a threat, that is going to start this cascade of inflammation. Essentially, it's going to trigger your HPA axis, right? Your hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, to signal down to your adrenal glands to produce cortisol and adrenaline. What happens when cortisol and adrenaline are produced? Well, a couple of things. For somebody with uh, a struggle with anxiety or panic, it might come out in an anxiety or panic attack. For a case that maybe is histamine intolerant, or a mast cell activation, or a SIRS, like a chronic inflammatory response syndrome, it might trigger a histamine flush. It might trigger a hive breakout, right? So, understanding, and then again, that confirmation bias comes into play. It's like, see, knew this was going to happen. And so, where we exit the cycle is very important. We do have to address all of those aspects, right? The biochemistry, the physiological hormone cascade, the emotional trigger. We have to address all of those things, but understanding that loop is really important, or in order to exit. And I think when you were mentioning before, kind of the over um, dramatized version, right? We do have to be careful with victim mentality and learned helplessness, right? Because that brings us into this partnership again. What are you partnering with on your healing journey? Are you partnering with fear and, kind of hopelessness, right? And like you said, normal, totally normal to feel a lack of hope when you've been at this for a long time. But I often, this is also a dicey conversation, but with all of my patients, at some point in their journey, I always use a whiteboard in my appointments, and we draw what their ego payoff is for their symptoms. And that's such a hard conversation to have, because nobody wants to admit that their symptoms are serving them in some way, right? That's pretty big to
Wow.
face. But oftentimes this cadence, this partnership was created subconsciously. They did not know that their brain and body, kind of created this contract in a way to protect or to guarantee something. And so when we actually get it up on the board, we see, oh my gosh, you just wanted to feel seen as a little kid. And so you always felt invisible. And now here you learned that, mom and dad paid attention to you when you didn't feel good. Okay, the body learned maybe that learned helplessness that got them love, that got them attention. And so we go through that and we see, oh wow, you just wanted to be seen and unconditionally loved. Can we fill that void without the symptom? And if the answer is yes, great. How can we do that? And then we go back and we do that parts and memory release, where we tell that little kid part, we identify how old were you when you created that partnership. We say, maybe it's 6-year-old you, right? 6-year-old you, like, here's the timeline. I'm an adult now. I unconditionally love you, right? There's a faith in there. God unconditionally loves you. And create this, again, way out of that loop, the exit out. But in order to understand that, we have to ask ourselves that really hard question of, am I having some sort of a payoff to continuing to be sick?
Right. Wow. This portion of, healing conversation has been talked about in some ways here before, but
Yeah.
never quite been phrased in the way that you phrased it. And I really like that. And I think, like you said, I'm sure people's like hairs almost stand up on their head
Oh yeah.
when they hear ego pay off. Like, I don't have an ego about this. If anything, it's the opposite. But it's like,
Exactly.
this is not a conscious thing. This is not something where we're
Uh-huh.
actively going, okay, so today I am going to respond this way because my symptoms are like this, and it's going to help me get through and feed me in X, Y, and Z type of a way, and then it's going to give me some sort of payoff. Like, that's not
Right.
consciously happening for us at all.
Exactly. Yes, and to go back to this idea of like no shame, when I'm asking that question to a patient, I'm not asking you, or I'm not telling you this is why you want to be sick. I'm saying this is, you need love. You don't want to be sick. You just want love, or you want fill in the blank, whatever it was, right? To have purpose, or to feel understood, whatever the core, essence of those human needs were. That's what I'm saying has gone unmet. And your body's learned to, it loves you so much that it's learned to fulfill that need, even in a way that doesn't make sense to you. And that might be through symptoms, right? So it's an empowering conversation, but for sure, I'm always kind of like, all right, here we
Mm.
go. We're gonna ask this question. And I just think for me in my own journey, that was one of the most powerful things to discover, not only for the breakthrough moment, but that's actually what you revisit in the future. Because when you create that breakthrough, great, we've untangled these parts, we've taken a look at these subconscious kind of agreements or partnerships with hopelessness or victim mentality or whatever it is. Now, how are we going to use that information to respond the next time you have a symptom? Because they're going to happen, right? We didn't just perform a miracle right here. God can do it. I cannot. But we didn't just go, oh, right, we're all done. We're good. We figured out what the subconscious pattern was. How are we using that information to dial it in and redirect that limbic pathway the next time you have a symptom? You might now reflect and pause and say, okay, I'm having a symptom. Maybe if the core wound was not being seen, where am I not feeling seen right now? Am I having an interaction that's not allowing me to feel seen? Or am I ignoring myself? Am I ignoring that I needed a little bit more rest yesterday and I pushed it? Am I ignoring that something's bothering me and I'm not stopping to process it, right? It might be within the self, it might not even be external, but having that information to come back when you have a symptom and learn how to self talk in a way that is productive and actually helps you identify your triggers, that's a game changer.
Oh, goodness. Yeah. I can't even. Wow. I'm sitting here like with all the thoughts, you know? I can imagine that so many people probably deal with or are challenged by some form of self abandonment. And that
Mhm.
really is at a core, at a core level, that's what they're facing because,
Yeah.
for, like I said, for a variety of reasons. And I would love to know, um, and maybe there's not a concrete answer for this, but with the people that you help, how quickly do you tend to see people's shift? And I mean like a tangible shift once they've created awareness around this truth, right? Or they've even gotten themselves out of an environment that has potentially been the catalyst for their symptoms. What
Yeah.
would you say you typically see?
Sure. So I work with a lot of chronic complex illness, a lot of chronic Lyme disease or mast cell activation syndrome, a lot of mold illness and autoimmune conditions, pandas, all the conditions that kind of fall under that umbrella, SIRS. And so I have a couple of different types of patient experiences, and I'll bring to the table the one that I see them have the most success. So we have folks we have locals. We also have folks that travel in from out of state and some even from out of country that will come in and do an intensive with us. And so it's a 3 to 5 day healing immersion experience. And what I see in those patients is we spend about 90 minutes of clinical time each day, one on one, and then they do their therapies, which could include things like oxygen therapy, ozone therapy, brain tap, which is a type of neurofeedback. It's auricular therapy, so sound and light therapy helps to calm down some of those emotional cortexes. And then they do massage and craniosacral therapy at the end of the day. And so for these patients, I have seen chronic complex cases come in for 3 days and they leave and they are like 80% better the next time I see them 6 weeks later because with those we're like, "What are we doing in those 90 minutes every day?" Right? Isn't the supplement protocol taken care of? Yes, it is taken care of. We usually get that solidified within the first day or 2, but what we're actually doing is we're asking the body through the specific type of testing and technique that I use, do you have any adaptations? Do you have any injury recalls, any traumas associated with this infection or this symptom? And so I like to go symptom and clear any emotional patterns, adaptations, injury recall, etc. And so we go down the list of their chief complaints and we take care of the layers underneath. And so kind of resetting the breakers in that way, as I like to call it with air quotes there, that might be some magnet therapy, it might be lasers, it might be microcurrent, it might be some brain retraining, like the parts work, or a little bit of taking care of NECs. And so those patients tend to accelerate and heal really fast because they've also put themselves again, they've partnered their mental congruency is I'm here to heal for a few days. This is my job. My job is to heal. Folks that just take the supplements and go home and they don't take the recommendations to, hey, we should do a couple brain retraining sessions. You should probably either pop in for some detox therapies or we should figure something out for you to do at home that's easy, accessible, maybe using things you already have. they can tend to take a little longer, right? They might take maybe 3 to 6 months to start seeing some meaningful changes. The only time I don't see big change is one, if the environment is not conducive to healing, right? So we're living in maybe toxic mold, there's a bunch of EMF in the house, or it's a toxic relationship in the house, right? Something, some kind of a dynamic in the home is toxic to their health. Or two, there's not a full like submission to that nervous system regulation piece, right? Barring that we've got no clinical information missing. We've got all the clinical information. Those are the two biggest things I see as roadblocks to somebody who's maybe been with me for years, right? And they're still working, they're a little bit better, but they're still working on chronic issues. And so sometimes we know for that person, your house is moldy, we're working on it, right? Or or maybe there's a little bit of like a tug for me to bring them in and do some more emotional work. But when all of the pieces line up and you're treating the structure, the biochemistry, the psyche and emotional, the bioelectrical, which is like the electrical signaling, the cell signaling in the body, and the health of the organs, you can see change really fast.
Yeah. Wow. I'm sure people's brains are turning right now, just going like, "Oh my goodness," because I think that well, actually, I'm gonna say something, and I can pose it sort of as a question, but and this is almost something that I would tend to ask at the end of an interview, but I think this is the perfect time.
Mhm.
There have got to be someone or multiples that are listening to this, and they're going, "Well, like I would love to do all of that, but I don't have the means at this time to
Yeah.
do all of that. And I really want to accelerate healing. I have been in
Yep.
this situation for, 5 years, 6 years, 10 years. And does that mean that hope is lost, or is that mean that I'm in a category where, not I'm just probably not going to see what I dream of. So, I know this is probably a tough question, but what would you say to someone who has those thoughts?
100%. Well, I think the first thing I would say is when it comes to resources, I'm a person of faith, and so I always believe that we're not given more than we can handle, right? So if what you can handle is doing some things at home, you can handle it. We can get you there, right? We'll be innovative, we'll be creative. But where I think the at home setup sometimes, or even my experience of working with patients remotely, I try as much as I can to get them to come in person first and then we transition into remote care. But I think that whether you're working remotely or you're doing this, on your own through your research and informative podcasts, etc., is you've got to make sure you have a teammate, whether that's a friend, a family member, significant other, a spouse, even a pet, right? Like having somebody on your team so you don't feel alone. That's number one, right? We sometimes always need like a hand to hold and grab onto. Maybe that's also a deep dive into a faith practice, right? So making sure you have a partner, a teammate in it is very important. But really, you have everything that you need within your own psyche, right? So if you can actually sit down, maybe with some book resources in a journal, you can for sure untangle some of these patterns. And so, for a lot of my patients that are doing this kind of as a DIY version, I will recommend some books that are very helpful. One book that I really like, I actually just posted about this on my Instagram, but Healing the Shame That Binds You by John Bradshaw is an excellent one.
I think I've
That's a
heard
great
that.
one for you have that one?
Yeah, I don't have it, but I think I've heard of the book, and I will put that as a resource in the show notes for people so that they can
Perfect.
yeah, I'm tagging that right now on notes, but
Yes.
sorry to interrupt. Go ahead.
No, I like yes, it's one of my favorites because I find also, and this was my archetype, so I'll resonate, with this example, but a lot of especially women that come to me with autoimmunity or chronic conditions, we'll talk about childhood things, and a lot of them are like, I wouldn't say I had a traumatic childhood. Most times they're like the goody two shoes that always got, the perfectionists that got praised for doing things. And so, what I like about this, because I'm like, well, how can I have childhood trauma? My parents were phenomenal. I have a great family. And it actually helps you understand, well, if you're the goody two shoes, you learned that you will get praised and loved when you achieve. And so, you're going to overdo it. You're going to overdo it and burn yourself out because you're afraid of losing love. Right. So it helps. That's one example. But the book, Healing the Shame That Binds You, gives you pretty much any family archetype and dynamic that you can think of. So as you're reading it, you'll identify with one of those structures in the story and be able to better understand maybe some of your origin story, especially if you're newer to doing some inner work. So that's a great one. I love that book. I also love You Were Never Broken by Jeff Foster. These are the two books I most commonly recommend to patients. Jeff Foster is a poet and an author, and he wrote this book while he was healing from chronic Lyme disease. And so he has a story, but he doesn't write it from the lens of you wouldn't know that he's writing this while he's very sick. But the way that he talks, I use this book as an example for my patients to say, hey, if you can spend 5 minutes a day reading a couple of these poems, I want you to mimic the way that you're talking to your body with how this book is authored, right? Because he really takes this kind of unconditional loving standpoint while still acknowledging that life is really hard right now. And I think that the tone that he uses in that book is instrumental to we all need to learn, right? If this tone is unfamiliar to us, this loving, unconditional self-talk tone, we need to learn it somewhere. And so I think that that book reference is a good place to start.
Wow. Wow, that sounds wonderful. And even if someone is really, like myself as an example, someone who's really pretty privy to this information and has done quite a bit of self-reflection and, awareness work and things like
Mhm.
that, that still sounds like something that could be super beneficial. So I'll definitely make sure to put those links in the show notes because yeah, those
Yep.
sound like great resources. Um, could you go actually, I would love to give you the option here, but I think that it would be really interesting to go into a couple additional modalities that you do use, one
Sure.
of them being bioresonance.
Mhm.
I know we talked about that on the site, and I think it's such a fascinating modality. And then anything else that you, I should say, use on a regular basis that people would be
Mhm.
interested in hearing about.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. So I use an old school bioresonance machine in the office. It's a German technology. And so bioresonance, it's really based in the science of biophotons. So it's sound and light detection. So every, molecule in nature has its own biochemical signature, is what I like to call it. And so the software of this bioresonance machine has all of those biochemical signatures stored in a library, a software library. If I have the patient in person, we put a set of headphones on the ear that has a light receptor inside of it, and they'll do the scan of the patient's nervous systems and the electrical emissions that are coming out of the body against this frequency library. And then if it's a virtual patient, we use a DNA sample of hair. And so it's a good way for us to non invasively get a lot of root cause information because we can actually check across multiple systems and we can check places where sneaky infections hide, right? 'Cause think about some things that are hard to get a diagnosis for, right? So like Lyme disease, mold toxins, maybe chronic viral infections, chronic strep, all of these things like to hide away, even parasites, right? They like to hide away in, the joints or the bile ducts in the liver and gallbladder or the cerebral spinal fluid, the gray matter, right? So they go hiding in these places, but we're still looking for them in blood. And that actually doesn't make a lot of sense if we think about it. It's not where they're hiding. We actually have to catch them on the move and mobilize them in order to get a positive blood test for some of these. And so this was a game changer for me in my journey. I had neurological Lyme and some mast cell and all of this stuff. And so the bioresonance was actually the thing that detected the Lyme disease for me after 5 years of looking for answers.
Wow.
And so that was super instrumental for me. And then the next step in my own healing journey was discovering a doctor that practiced BSI, biosystems integration, which is a form of kinesthetic resonance testing. So it's kind of like taking the bioresonance machine off of the computer and putting it onto the doctor's hands in order to essentially measure the friction in the protons, neutrons, and electrons that are coming off of, right, bioemissions, biological emissions off of the nervous system. And so in this technique, we can build a causal chain and we can say what needs to be done first, what needs to be done next, and how are we going to address this? And that might mean a supplement. That might be one of the services we offer. It might be magnet therapy, laser, microcurrent, brain tap, right? Something that is um, going to shift some of those electrical pathways or the limbic brain and the body's relationship with the toxin or infection that we're working on. So it's not only about detection from my perspective, it's about what order are we going in. It's not going to be the same for everybody. Your body has a unique order of operations, just like a math problem, right? We're not going to solve each problem the same way. And so, if we listen to your body, right down to what supplement do we want to use, what dosage should we do this at, how many days a week, we can yield a lot better outcomes and a lot less flare up reactions than if we were to just kind of guess and go with a one size fits all approach. And so I'm super passionate about the resonance testing because of how it changed my life. I was never able to really detox until I discovered BSI because I would start something and get so much worse. And I would just toss hands and be like, I cannot do this. Like, I need to function. I can't be, I was losing function in one of my hands and having like crazy neurological symptoms. And I'm going like, this is not sustainable, right? I need to find a way to heal while I'm living my life, or just take a time out and focus on healing, which unfortunately some of us do need to pause and do, which is totally fine. I ended up doing that myself. But once I found BSI, the recovery was absolutely like completely different, worlds different than 5 years of previous detox. It was like 5 years of work that I was chasing for answers was accomplished in 3 to 6 months using this system. So that's what I use in my office. And like I said, I can do that for virtuals as well using the bioresonance machine. It's just a little bit different as far as like that idea of resetting the breakers when it comes to those electrical pathways and all of that. And so, if a patient can get in and do a little bit of that work, it's always so valuable to reset some of the response to the infections we're working on.
Yeah, wow. Goodness. It almost seems like a really advanced version, and you can correct me or expand accordingly, but it almost seems like a really advanced version of like applied kinesiology or muscle
It is.
testing.
Yep.
Yeah, yeah.
Yep.
Like it's because well,
Absolutely.
you don't have equipment necessarily with muscle testing, and my practitioner currently uses applied kinesiology in his practice, and
Mhm.
it's been really instrumental for me through the years, off and on. But this seems like a notch up and different.
Yes, I had done a lot of applied kinesiology techniques, both as a patient and as a provider before stumbling on this one, because I was healing while I was in the field as a health coach, right? I was just trying to find my way.
Oh,
I know so many of us do, right? But it's beautiful. It's pain to purpose, right? So, what I describe as what's the difference between BSI and something else? Most applied kinesiology, when it comes to clinical applied kinesiology, we're asking yes or no questions, right? Is this good? Yes or no? Is this a problem? Yes or no? And the body's just a little bit more complex than a yes or no question, right? So let's say we're asking about a supplement. Is this colostrum good? Yes or no? Well, yeah, it probably is good because it's going to help reseal the lining of the gut. Is it going to completely take care of everything that's creating this histamine response in this patient? Probably not. So we need to see, is there anything more? Are there other layers? Is there anything outside of the biochemistry that we need to adjust in order to address the histamine issue? And so I think that's where sometimes the muscle testing, even for patients, can get kind of a mixed review rep because it's like either this worked amazing for me or it's like it did nothing and it sounded cool, but I didn't have a great experience with it. And so, if that is you, I would implore you to consider that it may have been approached as a yes or no question, and your body's just more special than yes or no, right? We need to go beyond a little bit. And that's why I love this system so much because it asks, is there anything more beyond this that we need to treat? Are there other layers outside of the chemistry file that we need to take a look at?
yeah, yeah. No, that makes a whole lot of sense. And I think that there are some practitioners. I've actually seen mine speak on this, and
Mhm.
he's actually speaks globally regarding stuff
Wow.
of this stuff, which is pretty cool. But one of the things that I've seen really good practitioners do with applied kinesiology is uh, they will be upfront and say your body will actually show, which it sounds like BSI does the same thing. Your body will actually show what it needs to address first. And so it will often give it in layers. I've seen that with myself
Yeah.
where, something doesn't come up 6 months ago. It didn't come up 6 months ago, but six
Yeah.
months down the line, now your body is going, okay, you know what? This is the layer you need to pay attention to now. And I've always found that to be so fascinating. But
Mhm.
I could see how a technology such as this modality that you're speaking of could sort of be like a clearer picture, so to speak. If that makes sense.
Yes. No, it definitely makes sense, and that's where the causal chain, right? 'Cause if we muscle test off of your priority, exactly right. You might have the top of your toxic, your allopathic stress load bucket, the tip of it might be parasite infections, but maybe there's really a deeper chronic heavy metal issue. And so now the next time you're coming to me, we treated parasites, but you're still not feeling great. Well, there's probably something else in that causal chain because of the symbiosis, right? That the body uses some of these infections to actually protect from other toxins, especially if the infection or microorganism has a biofilm. And so with the BSI, we can kind of go building this causal chain down to what we call an endpoint, which is like the endpoint of all things in this clinical trail. And then we're going to decide what are we going to treat first based on the body's priorities. So we have this big, like, global view of the information, and that will allow me to tell my patient expectation wise, hey, we're going to start at A, but we need to eventually get to B and C. I don't want to blow up your detox pathways. So just keep this in mind expectation wise. We're going to be working on this first, and we're going to see when your body's ready to work on the next thing without me throwing like 30 supplements at you, right?
Beautiful. Yes. Yeah. Cause that
Mhm.
happens so often. And it's happened with me
Yes.
too. I've done that, just not, it's not that I don't want to say not having awareness, but just, thinking like, okay, my body's resilient. It can handle, this. And then
Yeah.
I go and I just dip my toe in and it's like all of a sudden I can't walk, right? For
Right.
whatever however long. And it's just like,
Yeah.
whoa, okay. Like, I guess not. Right. Like where do we need to pivot
Where
here?
do we start?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Where
And
do
I
we start?
also think like that does happen, right? Like I'm not going to be like everything goes perfect with
Yeah.
right? Every patient. It doesn't always go perfect. I just treated a case this morning that we needed to pull back a dose on one of the remedies because there was a little bit of response. But again, understanding what's happening, what's the message behind the symptom to come back and say that for the 50th time. But is it a response to a supplement? Is it a response to your own toxins? Right? Are you responding to your own toxicity? And so what's this telling us? This is telling us it's treating the right thing, but maybe the push-pull mechanism that is detox needs to be adjusted a little bit, right? Where do we need to push? Where do we need to pull? Where do we need to slow down? So I think that's really important to keep in mind, especially as we're talking about health anxiety or health trauma as well. 'Cause again, it's a lot of times those reactions will provoke a flight response of saying, that's it, I'm out of here. See ya. I'm going to start something else. And so having appropriate expectations and the tools to self talk when things do crop up, especially when things are chronic and complex, that is very, very important to keeping yourself as regulated as possible while you're healing. And there was a moment in my healing journey where I was like at one of my worst points, but I really committed to like a grounding nervous system regulation practice that I started my day with. And it took me a while to realize, like months later in reflection of that, because I just lost the habit. I moved, I lost touch with the habit. And I thought to myself, my body was so much more symptomatic, but my inner world was so much more calm despite feeling like junk
Mhm.
because I had this nervous system practice that I was acknowledging how I was feeling and learned how to self talk and response. And so I think it's really powerful to say, like, what do I want? And most of us just want to feel safe. We don't feel safe in our bodies, right? I just want to feel safe. Well, how can we help you feel safe right now while you have a migraine or while you're having, some liver pain that's radiating in your shoulder, whatever it is, gut issues? How can we make you feel safe right here, right now to show your body this isn't a when then, this is a right now. This is a let's get that need met now so that there's an exit cycle out of the symptom loop.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Oh my goodness, this is so good. I'm wondering, this popped up as you were talking. I'm wondering how many times you've seen people come in and, they might think that they have some sort of infection or they're under the assumption like, oh, I must have parasites. I must have this. Or maybe it
Mhm.
is, they've read things about Lyme or MCAS,
Sure.
whatever, right? It could be like a myriad of things in the basket of chronic illness, chronic pain.
Mhm.
And it really is just the emotional, um, kind of maybe the trauma, maybe the emotional discourse that they've been through, this stuff that they've been sitting with,
Mhm.
that is creating this. Not that the symptoms, I want to be really clear about this, not that the symptoms are not real. They are 100% real.
Yeah.
And there really is no underlying infection. There's really no underlying thing, but it really is this almost this miraculous version of healing when
Mm.
that stuff is uprooted. Then the symptoms that they're experiencing, right? They start to dissipate.
Yeah. Yeah, I think I'm thinking of an example, like a case example, when you're bringing up this question. A lot of times in a case history, I'll hear something like, and I'll just take mast cell activation syndrome as the example because this is very common in a presentation like mast cell or autoimmune or one of these chronic complex multi-system conditions. A lot of times, we'll detect something, for example, like mold. Mold is something that I work with. That's one of my specializations. So mold is typically always a part of mast cell presentation, right? And so I'll say, well, let's check your home. And the person will say, well, I lived in my house before all of this started. I don't think it's my house. And their house comes back from mold. But we talk about the symptom timeline. And usually the thing that's keeping them stuck comes out of their mouth in the first couple minutes of the appointment because it subconsciously needs to come out. And so it's really like, how well are we listening to the patient as the provider? Because they're probably gonna give you the answer right there without even having to do any testing, right? And so in a lot of these cases, it'll be like, everything was fine until I had the loss of this person in my life or until I had this toxic relationship. And so we help them go back because, yes, there is a biochemical imbalance that you haven't been able to get rid of, right? It's not detoxing properly. And we have to come back to that bucket theory of like
Yeah.
the toxins, right? Your bucket was filled up almost to the top, it was managing it. Now, as soon as you had this emotional trauma, this loss, this whatever it was, stressful event, now your bucket's overflowing. And all of your attempts so far have been trying to deal with the toxins in the bucket that were biochemistry based, infection or toxin based, but nobody's addressed the trigger, right? That nobody addressed what pulled the gun. And so if we actually address that emotional piece, the trauma piece, we can then successfully clear these infections. And so I will say, rarely do I find, quote, nothing underneath, right? Because we are bugs.
That's
Our
true.
whole microbiome, right? We're bugs. So if we go looking for something, we will find something.
True.
But it's a matter of how much, right? What treatment approach do we need to be like on all of these supplements? Sometimes the answer is yes. Sometimes the answer is we actually need to do less. And in really advanced mast cell cases, some patients can't even tolerate supplements, so we have to start somewhere else, right? We have to start with the mental congruency of it's safe and okay for me to take this supplement. It's safe and okay for me to get better.
Wow. Yeah. Very relatable. I can honestly say, and I've mentioned this several times on the show that, like, I Epstein Barr just like it screams here because I that's something that I've dealt with through my life, and I was super super. If anyone's new to the show, got a very, very severe case when I was 17 and it just exploded. I mean, my whole life changed and little did I know that, it would change the trajectory of my life. And I had no idea. And I of course didn't have the support at the time or the right direction because who did, very little back then and there was no resources, there was no social media, there was no podcasting. People weren't talking about this kind of stuff. But some people can go through something like that and be then fine. And I say fine, in quotes, but sort of like it goes dormant and they continue to live their life. And others will sort of see this cascade of
Mhm.
chronic things pop up or maybe it's minimal. I feel like there's various circumstances that can be the case here,
Mhm.
but oftentimes, if it is quiet, and you can kinda go years and years and years and say, "Oh, yeah, I had this illness 20 years ago," then there's something that happens, right?
Mhm.
Like you said, maybe it's a toxic relationship, maybe it's a death in the family, maybe it's some massive change in life, and all of a sudden it's like, boom, and
Yeah.
that thing rears its head, whatever, Epstein-Barr, something, but Epstein-Barr is just it's so classic. I know it's the same with, like, mold and,
Yeah.
Lyme and things like that. And we recently talked about that in another episode, but Epstein-Barr is so sneaky and so tricky and just it's such an interesting virus to study, and people have different theories about it. But wow, was that just like screaming in my brain as you were talking about it because it just reminds me so much of my own situation.
Yeah, 100%. Right, and then you can even look if you really wanna get deeper into the
Yeah, yeah, please.
rabbit hole of, infections. A lot of times I'll talk to my patients too if they're having a little bit of a hard time connecting the dots between emotional patterns and the symptoms. We will then look at either the organ that is primarily affected by the issue we're dealing with, or we'll look at the pattern of the infection or toxin itself. So let's take Epstein-Barr, for example, right? Epstein-Barr is this, chronic virus, creates fatigue, right? Debilitating fatigue, and it often finds a way to attack the spleen, right? With like an acute case of mono.
Yeah,
And so if we look and we see, well, from a TCM perspective, the spleen a lot of times is related to how we feel about ourselves, right? Self worth, self confidence. Our contribution to the world and kind of feeling comfortable within our own skin. And we take a look at that emotional pattern. Is there something in that emotional pattern that resonates,
yeah,
that needs to be addressed? And then we can also look at it from a way of, what is the toxin itself? Like, for example, the molds folks that I'll work with, I'll say, mold and or fungus is either something rotting away and decaying or overtaking you, right? Think about what it does to uh, wood, right? It'll overtake it or rot it out. And so is there something that it's decaying, a relationship decaying, something rotting away, or is something completely overtaking and overwhelming you? Same thing with Lyme disease, it burrows, right? It's what's being buried away. And so there's an emotional question that we can ask each symptom, pathogen, organ disruption, and get a little bit more insight into what might be the pattern associated with it, because it's never just one or the other, just biochemical, just emotional. It's always a both and so these are the questions that I think can be instrumental to healing from some chronic issues.
absolutely. You really just nailed it. It's really almost never this or that. It is always this and that. And I wanted you said something about Epstein-Barr and the spleen. And from yes, that is absolutely so true. And I could even look back at my own history and my own life and go, "Oh yeah, I can see these little and I don't
Yeah,
want to call them memories, but these, feelings that you can revisit." And I'm one of those people that, my parents are fantastic and
yeah,
that just the up, it's like and I have such a lovely family and all these things, but that doesn't necessarily negate the fact that we don't go through things, right? And
yeah,
in our lives, like whether that's in the family unit or outside the family unit or, at school or whatever. But one of the things I wanted to point to regarding the spleen is it's also where fear lives.
yes.
And that's a big one from a TCM perspective. And I can see that how, like, if I look back, I could sort of see that pattern. And I also have asked myself the question back then, not obviously not me not knowing back then, but as I have become so much more aware of the connections here, I had asked myself years ago, uh, what was I so what was I so afraid of?
Yeah,
For me to have such an incredible response to
yeah.
this quote unquote virus, because I didn't just get Epstein-Barr and mono, I actually got infectious hepatitis at the same time. Like
Wow.
the only reason why I remember like the doctors and they'd sent me to some infectious disease specialist and they were like, like there's not really a whole lot we can do for her if we throw her in the hospital. Like she's got a passageway to breathe. So if she didn't, we could put her in the hospital, but she's
Yeah,
more comfortable at home. But it was such a severe case that at the time my pediatrician said he had never seen any child. He'd been practicing for decades and he had never seen anybody deal with a case like mine.
yeah.
And
Wow.
and I look back at that and I just think that is so interesting that my body it just expressed itself in that way
Mhm.
so severely. And so again, not in any form of like, okay, let's, go down the road of shame or like,
Yeah.
that whole spiral because that's not helpful, but more
Mhm.
just from a awareness perspective and also what patterns are potentially still around. And also where, how far y I or you or, whatever we're speaking or, if someone's putting themselves in this
Yeah.
position, how far we've come too, Like
Yeah.
it's about looking at the total picture. So I love this part of the conversation and I love TCM and I love exploring these
Mhm.
different paths of thinking because I do think that they could be very helpful and like I said, very instrumental in moving forward.
Absolutely. Yeah, and even on the kind of childhood trauma piece and reflection, we also have to remember, again, going back to how the brain works, ages 7 and below, we're very ecocentric, which means the world revolves around us in essence, right? This is where we're learning, right? We're dependent. We are dependent on our parents to meet our needs. And so what will happen is, especially now in our culture being, we've got, multi working parent household and all these things. What will happen to a kiddo's brain is, let's say, mom has to go to work, it then becomes in the egocentric brain, am I not worthy enough to be spent, have time spent with? And that's not anybody's fault, right? That's life. Like this is how on our world is operating now. And that's not the parents' fault. That's not the kid's fault for thinking that way. It's just understanding that that's how our brains are wired is that we interpret it. Even like a little kid that's seeing mom and dad have an argument. It's like, oh my gosh, what did I do to create this circumstance? Right. It's always about what about me? Not in a bad way. That's just how the kids' brains think. Right. So, what patterns develop 7 and below that as an adult, we look back and think, "That wasn't traumatic," right? Mom had to go to work, dad had to go to work. But the little kid egocentric brain held on to those things and started creating some neural pathways around it. And so I think that's important for some people to hear because I think it is easy for us to go, oh my gosh, now I feel shameful because I just let myself run rampant with these negative thoughts or beliefs, right? No, that's not what we're saying at all. It's about cultivating the awareness to understand with what did you do the best that you knew how at the time, right? What did you do with that? Where are those patterns living and can we uncover them so we can understand them better? And then if we need to and we want to yield change within that, that's step one. Now you have the opportunity to go back, reparent 5-year-old you and help bring that part up to date. Again, coming back to this idea of multiple parts, get that part stuck out of the memory, reassure it that, hey, you're unconditionally seen, heard, known, loved, and understood. Let's partner up and move forward.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. Absolutely. I had this thought too as you were speaking. By the way, that was beautifully said. And where I was thinking, what? And this is probably digging into specifics a little bit too much, but I would be remiss if I didn't share it. That birth order probably really makes a difference here. I know you're nodding here for people who are not watching and they're listening. I mean, because I can imagine that, like, being the oldest child, you tend to see certain things. Being the baby, you tend to see certain
Mhm.
things in patterns. Being the middle child, a whole nother thing. Am I right?
Yes, and even from a physiological perspective, the firstborn gets most of mom's toxic load. So whenever I have a really, yep, same chronic complex case, I say, were you the firstborn? And it's always a yes.
Yep, that would
Not
be.
always. I didn't generalize that. Most times it's a yes.
Yep, yeah, yeah. That would definitely be
Mhm.
me. That would definitely be me.
Yep,
And
same.
like, again, like it is what it is, right? We're just speaking factual here. It's nobody's
Oh
fault.
yeah.
Nobody's ashamed. This is just the way physiology works.
That's how it is, and I think that every again, when we come back to this idea of understanding what the purpose is behind all these things, not that we're trying to play God and understand why certain things happen, because we live in a broken world, things are gonna happen that are not ideal and they're hard, but we can understand, I think that for those of us who will embrace the journey, it's our path to walk, to untangle some of this, understand it so that we can find a level up to the purpose that we're being called to, or whatever we contribute to the world, right? Maybe it's not in a health space like you or I, but maybe it's in um, how you love your family, or maybe it's in your profession, the way that you interact with customers or clients, right? It's all about amplifying your impact. And so I think there's no coincidence to that birth order for sure, right? If you are an oldest dealing with a toxic load, it's not something to, fall victim to. It's something to say, what am I being called to in this healing journey that, what's my superpower in this? How can I leverage this as a tipping point for the purpose that I have in my life?
Yeah. Wow. Really, it really is all about perspective because like you mentioned earlier about the victim mindset, that's such a hard and tough place to fall into. And I think that it's always and only natural for us to hit that place, from time to time.
100%.
But I just don't think that it's, at the end of the day, it is self-serving and it's not good to camp there forever. And so, yeah, I completely and utterly agree with you. It can really just be a mindset shift that makes all the difference when we're talking about any of this stuff at all.
Mhm.
Right from the way that our body works to the opportunities that we have on these journeys, because it's about choosing your hard, and
Yeah.
it's hard no matter what, right? But wouldn't you? I always think to myself, oh my gosh, I can almost get emotional saying it.
Aw.
I always say, like, Lord, enable me to suffer well. Because
Yeah.
if I'm gonna walk down this path of suffering, I at least wanna suffer well, and I wanna be used as a testimony, because at some point, like, I wanna be used as an example so that
Mhm.
someone could look at my scenario, my situation, my life, and go, "Wow," like, when
Yeah.
it comes to suffering, that is something that I don't wanna use the word aspire because I don't even think that's the right word, but it's just like, that's the example,
Yeah.
right? And so it's like, if we're gonna suffer and if we're placed in a position in life, or you can call it what you want, but the whatever path you're walking down, if it's a tough one,
Mhm.
suffering well versus suffering in a way that is like completely detrimental. And again, this is
Yeah.
learned. This is not automatic. They
Yeah.
can make
Yeah.
all the difference, and it's a matter of awareness, and then it's a matter of application, because we can have all the knowledge about this stuff, but if we don't start to put some of this stuff into play, then that victim mindset can be really running the show in the background without even our knowledge.
Yes, and I think if we don't actually take the time to sit, like you said, and we all get there with like, "Oh my gosh, how could this happen to me?" Right? I can't believe this kind of whoa, this overwhelm, feeling victim to your circumstances. That's normal, and I think that if we don't allow ourselves to fully feel the weight of that, we can drag it on like a sack of potatoes behind us. And so it's never about, well, I'll just make the most of it right away. We don't want to just skip the part where you realize the weight of what you've been through. We want to acknowledge the weight of what we've been through, but then transform it into something different so that we're not constantly dragging it around like it's a part of our identity, right? And so um I can relate to that both through chronic complex illness and through sudden loss, and it's really important. Like um, chronic illness is a form of grief. You're grieving your old body, right? And so, like, that is something for sure that grief has taught me about even like my patients, working with my patients, is grief has its place too. And it's a continual journey, right? You will need to pause. You will need to grieve the life that you knew, the probably feeling of innocence that you knew without the pain and the suffering of your symptoms. But if you sit in the resonance of grief, sadness, hopelessness, disappointment, it's gonna be a really hard road, right? We wanna actually see what can we build from this? What's the beauty out of ashes? And you might not be there yet where you're seeing the beauty, and that's okay, but acknowledging how you're feeling and how it's impacted you, I think fully and completely actually gives the opportunity for you to set down that victim mentality because it's been acknowledged, it's been seen, heard, known, loved, and understood. You love yourself even in the the pit of it,
Yeah.
and you are loved in the pit of it, right? Whether you know it or not, you're so loved in the pit of it, and that love is what is the catalyst of pushing you forward, whether it's emotional or it's physiological, hopefully both.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah, this is a really important part of the conversation. And I love that you said, we can't gaslight ourselves. We have to understand that we need to feel the weight of what we've been through. And so many people, I think, it's interesting. I actually put out a post less than 2 weeks ago about capacity with chronic illness. And I think that one of the things that I shared, it was a post that I was speaking on, and one of the things that I shared was um the hardship that people feel. And I do feel like in a lot of ways it's more with women, but I do know men feel like this as well. Uh when they're going through something and they're not understood, that people around them do not get it. And that impact and that burden is so huge. And I know that I've also felt that way, which is why I spoke on it because I can
Mhm,
see how it really impacts people who are walking these journeys.
mhm.
And I think that it's really important because if we don't feel, and this is not like, therapy speak, this is true. Like, if we don't feel like we're ever seen, it's not like we're asking for something to be fixed in the moment. But if we don't
Right.
acknowledge what's actually happened, if we don't feel seen, and just there's someone maybe even on the other end that's like a presence, right? Then it's really
Yeah.
hard to heal from that because we're
Yeah.
constantly like, it's almost like I have a picture in my mind where there's water creeping up. Oh, and it's like you're almost like drowning in it.
Yeah.
It's like, and it's probably not even that, it's not even that deep, right? But you're just drowning because you're just looking
Yeah.
for someone to
Oh,
acknowledge,
yeah.
someone to see you, someone to. And I have felt that way off and on in my life, and I can honestly say that it's a without better terminology to use, it's a holdback, right? It will hold you
Yeah.
back if you find yourself there chronically, you know?
100%. Yeah, and that goes back to that idea of having a teammate, right? To help help with the floaties, right? Like put your floaties on if you're drowning a little bit, right?
Right.
Um, and I think that's where what part of so Vasandra Wellness, that's the name of my clinic. Our mission is to help support healing the way the body was designed by acknowledging and understanding the lived experience of chronic complex illness. And so I am a big believer in who you're working with, the capacity for you to, not in like a unprofessional overshare way, but to trust them with your story,
Mm.
and for that person and provider to actually listen to those pieces of your story. Like I mentioned before, of like usually the thing that is the problem is going to come flying out of the patient's mouth within the first few minutes, or be like, I don't know why this doesn't seem relevant, but I just wanted to share. And right, that's usually the
That's it.
the thing, that's usually the
Yeah.
catalyst.
Yeah.
And so if you don't have somebody, if somebody's just, they could have like amazing, amazing reviews, amazing credentials, incredible research, but it's like a quick 10-15 minute appointment. And now you're like, I feel like I'm swimming in a giant ocean by myself. Maybe it's telehealth, maybe it's a quick rushed, right, appointment. You do need a teammate to sit with you like as the waves are crashing. And just know that if you are working in that way right now and you are a chronic complex case, you might just need to fill in some gaps on your clinical team, right? So that might be working with a therapist that's well informed on chronic complex. So maybe your doctor's got your biochemistry covered, but now maybe your therapist, your counselor, you're able to actually process some of that because they're informed on how to help you through some of this. And so that's another thing to kind of revisit this idea of how do we build that team if you don't have the resource to take on all these things at once. That might be a good way, is just thinking of each one of those pieces as maybe a member of your team so that you're not feeling super overwhelmed like you're drowning in a bunch of supplements and food rules.
Oh my goodness, and that is ever so common. It really is, and I say that, it's like I feel like I need a button that I press because I often say, like, I say this all the time, and I do. I feel like a broken record. That
Uh-huh.
it's really like, people have specialties, and that's like,
Yeah.
it's a good thing and a kind of a hard thing all at the same time these days
Yes.
because there are so many specialties. But um, I agree with you where I think that it's really difficult to find people who really like fill in all the gaps, as you said, like, and so if there are people listening that, maybe they do have an amazing doctor who's covered a lot of ground, but there's
Yeah.
maybe a couple aspects that are missing, it might just be worth thinking about or bringing somebody in that can
Mhm.
help fill in these parts, right? Because
Right.
those parts are, potentially I don't want to say missing piece, but maybe can really elevate you out of the place where you feel the most stuck. So I really like that.
Yes.
Yeah, it's super,
All of
super
that work lays the foundation for the best biochemistry support to actually take hold. And
yeah.
so again, that's not to discredit anybody that anyone's working with. It's to say you might have the best supplements, but if there's not a foundation of congruency that you're ready, willing, able to heal and come into alignment with all those subconscious parts and all of the cell signaling and communication from top down, bottom up, then we have a shaky foundation for that biochemistry. And so I just think like driving that point home of take an assessment of your healing plan right now. Do you need to fill in the gaps? Do you need to read that book? Do you need to do some EFT tapping right on your nervous system as you're taking your supplements, right? To let your body know, hey, you're safe while we take these remedies. Do you need to do some brain retraining when you have a symptom flare up the next time and do a little self check on a confirmation bias? So there's all of these little ways that we can kind of do a self assessment on are there areas, are there gaps in my healing approach? Um, and that oftentimes informs a great way forward, a great next step. And that's really all it's about is don't worry about tackling everything at once. If you are doing this on your own, you're a DIY researcher and self healer, just take the next right step. Because, like you talked about with capacity, we never want the stress of the protocol to be more stressful than your symptoms. So, if we can just take the next right step in our capacity, that will yield a lot more benefit than trying to overwhelm ourselves and take it all on our shoulders on our own.
100%. Wow. This might be one of the the most important conversations this show has ever seen, because I think that this is yeah, no, this and I do not say that lightly, because I feel like there are so many people who are quote unquote stuck and feeling stuck. And and I say stuck because I don't necessarily think any of us are stuck. I think that we're always healing even when we don't think that we are, right? Because the body is always doing these amazing things behind the scenes that we're not even aware of. And it's always adapting, which is in part healing in and of itself, which is fantastic and fabulous and
Oh,
probably a conversation for another day. But I just think there are so many people out here, on my recent show, episode 100, I was a reverse interview, and, my stand-in host, she asked me a really interesting question about, like, one of the things I think that I have seen as a change in me, or, like, what I've experienced as I've sat here, right, and talked to so many people, and I think that one of the things that I know one of the things that I said was that I think that I became even more aware of the
mm,
amount of people who are suffering, because I thought I knew, like, I thought that I had a good grip on how many people were in these positions of chronic health conditions and
oh,
concerns, or maybe didn't have the quote unquote label and are searching for it, or they've just been dealing with things that like you said earlier, where they've just adapted and they think that their life is normal, but really the things that they're dealing with are not that normal.
right.
And I don't think that I even like I think I felt like I knew, but I don't think I
Mm,
even had a clue,
wow.
as to how many and so this conversation is almost like a it's almost like I wish I would have had it. I wish I could have had a conversation like this at the beginning of the show, right? Because
Right,
it's
right.
kind of a foundational it's foundational talk for people that are because who's seeking these posts or excuse me, these podcasts out? Who's seeking these interviews out, right? They're not the people that are just living life, feeling high and mighty and like don't
Yeah.
have a care in the world. It's the people that are struggling. It's the people that are
Yes.
looking for answers. And this really is that type of conversation that I think is that groundwork talk
Yeah.
that could have saved me a whole lot of heartache, right? A whole lot of extra steps and pivots. And, again, the journey is the journey, right? Like it is what it
Right.
is. And there's a purpose,
Yeah.
like you said, there's a purpose to all of it. And, I trust in that always. But,
Mhm.
I think like so much of the reason why I'm sitting here in the first place is that if I could save, and I don't mean save literally, but if these conversations could help
Mhm.
people shorten the journey, right? And not have the struggle go 20 years, right? Maybe it's 2 instead of 20, then thank God, and this is just one of these conversations I think that can be a total game changer for the ear that has been, that has been through a lot. Someone who's listening that's just been through more and potentially wants to give up, throw their hands up in the air. So
Yes.
as we really start to close here, I would love to give you an opportunity to touch on anything else that you might think is really important. I feel like we've covered a lot of
Oh,
ground, but I mean, there's just so
yeah.
much, But if there's anything that you want to, I guess,
Mhm.
highlight or showcase, or even speak to those people out there that really do need some, I guess, confidence in the
Yeah.
journey that they're walking down and through, well, what would you say?
100%. I think that one of the things that I hear the most often as, we because healing is so cliche, but healing really is not linear. Sometimes we adopt that in an emotional sense, but in a physical sense, that's very, very true, right? And so you might be doing this for a long time, and then you have a little one of these, right? You have a little dip in the journey. And what I hear a lot in that, and what I was tempted to fall into, and I was in that position was, I knew this was going to happen. I did all this work for nothing. It doesn't even matter, right? And those are lies. Those are lies. We can't partner with them. They will try to come up, and we have to actually take that bird's eye view and say, I did this. I didn't do this, right? And go all the way down back to where I started. It wasn't all for nothing. And when we're healing and we're tracking our progress, it's so important to acknowledge and come back to, like you said, where we've been and reflecting on where we've been. Great. Did that symptom used to happen to you every day and now it only happens to you twice a month? That's progress. But it still happens. It still happens. I'm frustrated. Yes, that is frustrating, but we're still working on it. And it's important to remind your body how far it's come and that you guys are on the same team. And so I think that is kind of like, we'll pull it into home base here with remembering, your body is working for you. These were some affirmations. I'll close my sharing with this. These were some affirmations that I um prayed on, did some EFT tapping on, and journaled on every day. My affirmations while I was healing were, my body is working for me. My body was designed to heal, and my body is releasing all that does not serve my greatest and highest good. And so find some truths that you can hold on to that will still be true on good or bad days, right? If I was having a bad day, my body's still releasing stuff that's not serving me. My body's still designed to heal, right? All of these things are still true despite the ups and downs. And so find something that you can kind of hold on to as your anchor while you're healing through the ups and the downs so that you can start to teach your brain safety amongst the infections, the toxins, the emotions that you're still working on, right? We can actually create safety right here, right now, and help to teach that new pattern to your brain so that it has an easier time going through some of these healing processes and protocols that you're doing.
Ah, yes. Just yes. Yes times 100. And I love those
Mhm.
affirmations, and they might seem so simple, but I think that there's so much to say about simplicity, right? And like
Yeah.
how
Mhm.
those things can really be have it's like effective thing. I had a guest on the show one time and he says it often, effective things don't have to be complicated. Um
Oh, I love that.
yeah, and it's like,
Yeah.
it's like sometimes the simplest things can make such big changes. And the other thing
Mhm.
that came to my mind, which I often repeat to myself, and I've written on this as well, and I'll
Mm.
probably write on it again someday, is that your feelings really are not always facts. And that can
Mm.
really be so hard when you're dealing with, a hard, complex case. Yeah,
Yeah.
and I obviously both know that. And it's so hard to fit in. And it's not about dismissing feelings or gaslighting
Oh,
yourself,
yeah.
but a lot of times we can convince ourselves of a truth that is not true, right? It's a version of the
Yes.
truth,
Yep.
or if it's, and it can be really harmful to us and our spirit. So, I absolutely agree. And yeah, I feel like I could continue this conversation for another few days and still have more thoughts and
There's
still
so
have more
much to
thoughts.
talk about on it for
There
sure.
really is. But I would love for you to share with our friends where they can learn more about you if they want to work with you, whether they're
Yeah.
local or virtual, and all of the things that you have to offer. Just, yeah, share with us, and I'll make sure to put these things in the notes for everyone.
Awesome. Thank you. I appreciate that. So, like I said, are based in Greenville, South Carolina. We're actually opening up May 1st a integrative medicine clinic slash healing arts studio model with some arts therapies targeted towards some of those chronic conditions and those patients that are struggling maybe with hypermobility like EDS, or music therapies for PANS cases, or kids that are on the spectrum. And so we have a lot of unique ways that we're going to start bringing healing into the community too, in those ways. And so if you're local, you can come on in and visit us. Um, you also can book an immersion if you are not a local. If you're a local too, you could do an immersion, but most times we just schedule you out for some therapies over the course of a few weeks. A lot of folks will fly or drive in, do an intensive, or we can work together virtually, like I talked about before with the DNA hair sample testing. Our website is somasonderwellness.com. Um, Instagram, you can find us at Somasandra Wellness or at Dr. Krista Morton. And those would probably be the two best routes to go find out more about us.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, my friends, like I always say, I will have all of this listed in the show notes for you. And if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out if there's something that you need or you can't find. Either myself or Dr. Krista, I'm sure would be more than happy to serve you to the best of, either of our abilities. I don't even have the words other than thank you doesn't cut it. I feel like this was
Oh my
such a
gosh, thank you.
fantastic conversation. And it's like, and again, I say this as the broken record that I am. I often just like these interviews with well, obviously with a learning heart, but I think like, oh, I'm sure I probably have a good gauge on, all the things that are going to be spoken about and this and that, and it's like I've had this whole path and all these years behind me and I still leave conversations like this having a slightly new perspective,
Oh,
which is just that like slightly or even intermittently shifts my lens even more because there's just a richness and a depth and things that are spoken in different ways that open
yeah.
up my eyes. And that has been this with you. So
Oh, wow.
this has been fantastic. And I just am so thankful, that that I know you've got a busy situation and practice in life over there, and so thank you for taking the
Oh,
time. It's really meant a
oh my
lot.
goodness. Oh, thank you so much for having me. I've so enjoyed this conversation. And like you said, if it helps support one listener, or hopefully lots of listeners, but if it helps support one person, it's always worth, sharing our stories. So thank you for having me. I super appreciate it. It's been an honor.
Oh, goodness, it's been such a pleasure. All right, my friends. Well, again, thank you so much for listening. I appreciate each and every one of you. And like I said, if you need anything, don't hesitate to reach out. And until the next episode, have a very blessed day, and I will see you soon.